I got an extra day in my year, and you bet I spent it all reading. Hi, welcome, come on in. My name is Aoife, and today I am taking you through all of the books that I read for February, as well as my February reading statistics. I feel like my reading went a little bit up in February comparing to January of this year. I was definitely out of the little reading slump that I had that kickstarted 2024 for me. I settled a lot more into my reading speed, and I managed to find my first 5-star for the entire year. Starting with the statistics, I read 9 books in February and I DNF'd a further 2. Of those 9 books, 8 were targeted for an adult audience, whereas 1 was a YA book. I read 2 books physically, 2 were ebooks, and 5 were audiobooks, and all of that totaled up to 1,898 pages and 40 hours of audiobook listening. Surprisingly, for the genres, romance was not my most read in February. I only read 3 romance books, whereas I read 2 historical fictions and 4 contemporary or literary fiction books. As for the star ratings, as I said, I gave out my first 5-star book in February, and that was the only book that I gave 5 stars to. I also gave 3 books 4.5 stars, 2 books got 4 stars, and 3 books got 3.5 stars. As usual, let's start with the DNFs. And early on in February, I DNF'd Something Wild and Wonderful by Anita Kelly. I had some pretty high hopes about this one. I absolutely loved their first book, Love and Other Disasters. It was like the perfect book had been written for me. It featured baking, it featured an LGBT romance, and the LGBT romance theme does appear here as well when you have Alexei and Ben, who have gone out on the Pacific North Coast Trail and who meet each other at different areas across the journey. But there was just something missing about this book. There was no spark in it that kept me going in the same way that Love and Other Disasters had. You do see some of the characters from Love and Other Disasters pop up here. London from the first book is a friend or a sibling or cousin, some kind of close connection to Ben, who is one of the characters here. So I really loved seeing them again and seeing Dahlia again, but there was just nothing that kept me growing with this book. I listened to the audiobook of this one and I found that I had gotten to about 18 or 20%, and I wasn't particularly sure what was happening. I wasn't sure where we were in the story, what had been going on, all of the journeys that we had been brought on, and I didn't care enough to want to go back and start and listen again, but I also didn't care enough to continue and to find out more, so I put this one to the side. I also DNF'd Dating Dr Dil by Nisha Sharma, and I think this one just did not work for me in terms of the retelling. This is a retelling of The Taming of the Shrew, one of the Shakespearean works, and it's not one that I'm very familiar with. I don't particularly know the story, I don't particularly know who the characters are and what happens and why this character in this story relates to this character from The Taming of the Shrew. And I have found out that that is something that I need to know when I am watching or reading or listening to a retelling. I need to be able to see, okay, this person corresponds to this character, and this situation that they are in is supposed to represent this situation from the original text. It was something that just was missing for me, and I think if I had a little bit more of an insight to what The Taming of the Shrew is, maybe I would have gotten on better. Let's start with the 5-star read, because that was actually the first book that I read in February, and of course it was Heartstopper Volume 5 by Alice Oseman. This was one of my most anticipated books of the second half of 2023, and I utterly fell in love with this. This is the continuation of the story of Nick and Charlie, who meet each other when Charlie joins Nick's rugby team at school, and they start a friendship, and then the friendship turns into a relationship. In this book, things are starting to get a little bit more serious between the two. They are starting a discussion about having sex for the first time, but also Nick is after finishing his A-levels, and he is now looking at where is he going to go for college in the next year, where is he going to study, and what other universities has he got in his mind aside from the one that is practically just down the road from them. I feel like this is a story that a lot of people around Nick and Charlie's ages, so 16, 17, 18, are really going to see themselves in. There's a lot of people who are in relationships at the time and who don't want to have to think about going into a long-term relationship because one of them is going to college in Dublin, one of them is going to college in Galway, for example. When you are split between two different points of the country, you're not going to see each other every day. You're not going to have the opportunity to just call around to their house after dinner and see them and watch TV together. It's definitely something that a lot of teenagers are going to find themselves in, and it is also definitely something that I think they're going to find a lot of comfort in, to see potentially their favorite characters also going through the same decision making process and the same struggles as they are. As I said, there is also the discussion of Nick and Charlie having sex for the first time, and this is dealt with so wonderfully. There's never any pressure on the two of them. There is a really mature discussion between the two of them of, are we ready? How do we want to go about this? Where do we want it to happen? And that is definitely something that I feel will represent sex in a really positive light for people who, like Nick and Charlie, are of the age that they are starting to discover their sexuality and starting to discover sex. What I also really liked about this book is that we get a little bit more of an insight into Charlie's mother. I feel like she's a very strict and a very misunderstood character, but seeing some of her background, seeing some of her backstory, it really opened up a whole other way of seeing her in me. I really thought about her in a different way. I saw her in a different light. And it just made me think about her a little bit differently. This is the second to last book in the series. I think the final one is coming out either this year or early next year. And it's going to be a really bittersweet time to say goodbye to these two. The next book that I started, I didn't particularly finish this until well into the rest of the month, but that was Babel by R.F. Kuang. Now, I know so many people who have truly loved this book. I know so many people who have made it their entire personality. But I am very middle of the road with this one. I read this as a buddy read with my friends Charr from Thoroughly Enjoy Books, Shannon from 155 Books, and Charlotte from Coiny Reads. We split it into one chapter every work day, and then for the weekend we had 3 chapters that we would try and catch up on. And I think that kind of juddered stop and start reading style just didn't work for me. It took me out of the story a little bit too much, and when I was only reading one chapter, it took me a while to get back into it for the next day. But there were a couple of days that I had fallen behind or hadn't picked up the book, and then I got much more interested and much more invested in the story because I was giving it a little bit more time. I am still sitting on my thoughts with this one, and I probably will still be sitting on my thoughts with it for a while. I gave it 3.5 stars, and I feel like that could be subject to change if I go back and read this one again. It is the story of Robin, who was born in Canton in China, and he is the only survivor of a cholera outbreak in his small village, and he is taken away by Professor Lovell. He's taken away from his small little village and brought to England, where he is trained and prepared to join the Babel Society, which is a translation kind of course or like a study in Oxford. While he is there, he also meets Rami, who is also of an Asian background. He meets Victoire and he meets Letty, and he also meets with Griffin, who is a member of the Hermes Society, or the Hermes Society. I'm not entirely sure how that should be pronounced. I really enjoyed the friendship between Rami and Robin. I feel like they were supposed to find each other, and I absolutely loved watching them get so much closer as the book goes on. But also it does take a really dark turn towards the end of it, and you see friend turning on friend and brother turning on brother, and there's so much death and destruction and hatred in the pages of this book. It's a really interesting read. It is a really gripping read, and as I said, the days that I was kind of flowing along with the story, I was actually getting invested in it. It's just not the kind of book that I think works if it's broken down into such minuscule chunks. So, what I think I need to do is to go back to this one again in a couple of months. I need to give it a little bit of time to kind of sit, and I need to digest it. Then, maybe towards September, October of this year, I will go back, I will pick it up again. I know that Brittany from Brittany Loves Reading absolutely adores this book. She put it on her host favorites for the Battle of the Girl Bands readathon. And she said to me that she actually immersion read it. So she listened to the audiobook while she was reading the physical copy. That might be the best way to go about it, but I don't think this is the last time you'll see me read Babel. Then, to finish off a series, I read Mrs. Porter Calling by A.J. Pierce. This is the third and final installment of the Dear Mrs. Bird series, which are all set in 1940s London around the time of the Blitz, coming towards the end of World War II. And you are following Emmeline Lake. She is working as an advice columnist in a magazine in London called Woman's Friend. She initially starts out as the kind of a secretary or understudy for Mrs. Bird, who is the previous advice columnist in the magazine. And when Mrs. Bird moves on, Emmeline is brought up the ranks. In this third book, the magazine has changed hands. It is now under the ownership of Mrs. Porter, who is the niece of the former owner who has passed away between the second and third book. However, Mrs. Porter has some slightly different ideas for the direction she'd like the magazine to go. Instead of the recipes and instead of the advice column and instead of the kind of cheery articles, Mrs. Porter really wants to turn it into a kind of a high society publication. She wants to feature all of the debutantes that have come out this year, or she wants to focus on some of the weddings of the high society that have taken place. It's not exactly the readership that Woman's Friend has been looking at recently, but the workers go along with it for a while. Then there starts a very quiet revolt between the editors of the magazine and between the writers, and eventually things start to come to a head. I hated Mrs. Porter. I really hated her, but she's such a compelling character, and you cannot stop reading about her. I felt like I could not stop hearing about the things that she was doing, or about the ideas that she had, or some of the strange turns of phrases that she had. Everything was just a little bit as in a little bit miserable. And that's something that is still floating around in my brain. Even though I read this book towards the start of February, it's still floating around in my brain to this day. I also really loved watching the workers kind of fight back and kind of stand their ground and say, no, this is something that has been working the whole time. We're not looking to change that up, or no, this is something that we have tried before and it wasn't something that was well received, so we're not going to try it again. Of course, there are also developments in Emmy's life outside of her working opportunities. She has a best friend named Bunty who lost her partner towards the start of the war in a bombing. And Bunty is starting to open her mind to the opportunity of love again. She's starting to kind of put herself back out there, which was something that I truly loved seeing. It was done so delicately and so well. I could not help but cheer for the two of them. However, as you can imagine about a book that is set in World War II, there is quite a lot of death, there is quite a lot of grief and heartbreak and turmoil, and this was absolutely rife in this book. About 75% of the way through this book, we lose one of the characters that I truly adored reading about. They were so beloved, and you can tell that everyone in their entire circle, be it family or friends, truly loved and respected them. And I think that the outpouring of grief, but also everyone kind of coming together and helping out those who were left behind, it was really inspiring to read, and I absolutely loved seeing it, even though hearing about it did make me break down in tears while I was out for an evening walk. I feel like this was a really great way to finish out this series. I had a little bit of a dip with Yours Cheerfully, which is the second book in the series, so I'm really glad that Mrs. Porter Calling brought it right back up. Then I read A Love Song for Ricki Wilde by Tia Williams. This was my first book by Tia Williams, so I didn't particularly know what to expect going in here, but I was completely blown away by this one. As you can imagine from the title, it is following Ricki Wilde, who is the youngest daughter of a fairly well-to-do socialite family in Atlanta in Georgia. Her parents own a funeral home, which is basically a funeral home empire in Atlanta, and her three older sisters are all also part of the family business. One of them has just decided to set up a cafe, for example, where when you've just been told that your loved one has passed away, you go into the cafe next door and you go and order coffee or cake or whatever you want to have, and you sit down and you reminisce about them with everyone else, which sounds really nice, but is also a little bit strangely morbid. Ricki decides that this isn't the business that she wants to go into, and she has actually been silently working on setting up her own floral business on the side, and tells her entire family everything about it one night while they're at dinner. They don't particularly take it very well because Ricki has always been seen as very flighty and kind of takes up something and then hyperfixates on it for a couple of weeks, and then it's tossed to the side. To prove them wrong, she heads off for New York, where she kind of rents out a little brownstone in Harlem and moves in next door to an old woman named Miss Della, who takes Ricki in as her kind of surrogate granddaughter. And I really loved watching this relationship between Ricki and Della come together and flourish while Ricki was there. I also really loved watching Ricki's floral business completely take off. She's booked as the florist for a huge kind of influencer style wedding in New York, and this just catapults her to fame and to riches. She is the subject of either a painting or a photograph at the auction, and this was done by her best friend Tuesday that she has met while she's in New York. And the photo slash painting is bid on for an absolutely insane amount of money by somebody who basically disappears after the auction. Ricki and this man meet each other again by chance a couple of days later, and this throws everything into chaos. It turns out that Ezra is not exactly who he says that he is, and he might not be from New York as we know it. This book is kind of a leap day fiction. It takes place across the entirety of February of 2024, but there is also a dual timeline which starts in around 1924, I think. And this was genuinely so interesting to read. I absolutely loved watching the two timelines kind of collide together in a way that I didn't particularly expect it to happen. If I think back about the book, there's probably things I should have picked up on and said, oh, this is a sign that something is going to be coming. This is a sign that this is what this means. But it just completely went over my head. To the point where when we had a big reveal about one of the characters later on in the book, I kind of stared at my Kindle for a while going, really? I absolutely loved this book. The writing style flowed so well. It is so funny. It was not super spicy for a romance, but there were a couple of really well written and really well placed sex scenes throughout this book that I enjoyed. I absolutely love Tia Williams' writing, it turns out, and I cannot wait to get to 7 Days in June, which is on my TBR behind me. I'm so excited to see how that book is going to go for me. Then I read Eleanor, Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. This was a reread because I wanted to read it for my book club here in Berlin. And while I didn't get called in for it this month, I do still have quite a lot of thoughts about it. So you guys are going to be blessed with them. This book follows Eleanor Oliphant, who is about 29-30. She's living in a flat in Glasgow on her own. Every Friday night, she leaves her office, goes to the corner store and gets a frozen pizza and 2 bottles of vodka, and then sees herself through the weekend with those until she goes back to work on Monday morning. She and one of her co-workers one day see a man on the street collapse and have a heart attack, and this basically enlarges Eleanor's social circle, but also gives her a different understanding about the world. Eleanor is rather contrarian. She has a lot of kind of ways of thinking about the world that other people might not agree with completely. Every Wednesday, she calls her mother for 10 minutes just to kind of keep her tenses going, just to kind of keep that relationship ticking over. But you can tell that this relationship isn't all as it seems, and it's definitely not a relationship that's particularly rosy. She is also very blunt and she is very to the point. For example, when she is getting her nails done at a nail salon, when she is asked if she wants to book a repeat appointment, she looks the manicurist dead in the eye and says, no, why would I do that? I can do this at home better and for free. Eleanor at times reminds me of a toddler who has absolutely zero filter. It just goes from brain to mouth with nothing in between to say. Maybe don't say that one out loud. She is at times frustrating to read about, but she's also really compelling and really makes you want to pick the book up more and see where her story is going. As you get towards the end of the book and you realize some of the situations Eleanor has been in, why she thinks the way that she thinks and why she acts the way that she acts, it does really make you feel for her and it does really make you empathize with her quite a lot, even if you did find her hard to read. I also really enjoyed the discussion of loneliness, particularly in younger people, of alcoholism, and of abuse that this book brings up. I really wish that I had been at book club this month because there were so many things about this book that I really wanted to talk about, and there are so many other people's opinions of it that I wish I had been able to see. So, if this is a book that you have read, please tell me below one of your favorite points of it or something that has stuck with it ever since you read it. In keeping with the system of reading leap year books in a February that has a leap day, I also read Once Upon a Leap Year by Anna Bell. I'd read some of Anna's books before, but I was a little bit concerned about it because I have kind of moved away from women's fiction, chick lit, contemporary fiction, if that's how you want to describe it. I read a lot more kind of contemporary romances, steamy romances. So I was a little bit concerned as to how this book was going to go, but I really, really enjoyed this one. It's about Lucy and Noah, who meet each other while they are on a kind of a booze cruise to Calais one night when they are in their second and first years of university. It turns out that Lucy and Noah are both leap babies, and this little trip to France is taking place on leap day. So they decide to break away from the group and celebrate their birthday together by going to a little creperie and getting crepes together. For the rest of the book, it's split into the parts of every single leap year. And you follow them and their group of friends in the lead up to leap day, in the lead up to celebrating their birthdays. And you also get to see the changes that have happened in their lives between now and when their next birthday will be. Whether there have been breakups or move-ins or deaths or new family members or marriage or new babies come along. It turns out that this is something I really enjoy reading. I absolutely love reading a book that focuses on the changes and the differing opinions that can happen in your friendships when something happens in your life. When you have gotten married, or you have gotten separated, or you have moved into a new house, or you have had children, or you don't want to have children, but the rest of your friendship is having them. It's something that's happening in my life at the moment where a lot of my friendships are in flux because some of my friends are getting married, some of my friends are buying houses, some of my friends are having children, whereas these are not things that are happening to me. So it's a very different situation that we're all in. And how do you navigate the changes in friendship in that? How do you navigate different responsibilities? How do you navigate different schedules or different needs when everyone is going through something different? I absolutely loved reading that part. There is also a part of this book that is set in Dublin, which I really enjoyed because I love reading books that will bring me back home in some way. So this was a really nice little added bonus into the book. And to be honest, I think I undersold this book to myself. I had said to myself, this isn't the kind of thing that I read a lot anymore, so I'm not going to have a great time with it. I'm just going to plod through it, but I'll get it done. I genuinely should have given it a lot more credit at the start than I did because I had such a great time with this one, and it is definitely one that I would recommend you pick up. I also needed a bit of a comfort read in February, so I picked up Oh My God, What a Complete Aisling by Sarah Breen and Emer McLysaght. I'm planning on reading the rest of the series throughout March so that I can get to Aisling Ever After, the last book in the series, by the end of the month, but I felt like I needed a little bit of a refresher on the start of the series so that I could get to the end of it. This is about Aisling, who is 28 years old and she grew up in rural Ireland, is now working and living in Dublin, and has been with her boyfriend John for about 7 years now. And this is the stage where Aisling is starting to expect a proposal and a new house and all of the things that other friends of hers are going through. When a holiday to Tenerife doesn't particularly end as Aisling had planned it to, and actually ends with the couple barely on speaking terms with one another, everything is turned on its head. She has to come back home and figure out what is it that she wants in life. Does she actually want that picture perfect marriage and babies and house, or does she want something a little bit different? She moves in with her colleague Sive and with Sive's friend Elaine, who seems to have a friend named Ruby over all the time. But Aisling doesn't particularly put two and two together that Elaine and Ruby are in a relationship together, which kind of harks back to the innocent country bumpkin portrayal of Aisling that we see throughout this book. They also go on a trip to Berlin, which, like I said about the book that was set in Dublin, I love reading a book that is set somewhere that I have lived or that I have been on holiday or that I currently live. And as somebody who lives in Berlin right now, it was genuinely really interesting to see it from the eyes of a tourist as someone who's been living here for almost 3 years now. Something to be aware of if you are going to go into this book is that it does deal with a family member who is suffering from a brain tumor and who does pass away from it. One of the authors, Emer McLeod, her dad actually passed away from a brain tumour about 8 or 10 years ago by this stage. The book is dedicated to his memory, and I felt like it was such a nice way to honour him and to make him a part of the story and make him a part of the Aisling universe. And you can tell that he would have been so proud of Emer, and that is definitely something that she says in the dedication to him. But I thought it was such a lovely nod to what had actually been happening with the authors themselves, and to make his spirit live on a little longer. Something else you might want to be aware about is that these books are incredibly Irish. There are a lot of references to Irish pop culture references, there's a lot of Irish slang in here, and I do wonder if that's going to be a little alienating for people who didn't grow up in Ireland. These books were translated into German a couple of years ago. In German, the title is OMG Diese Aisling. And reading through some of the reviews in German on Goodreads, I wonder if that was a good idea. I wonder if maybe it alienated the reader base a little too much. I understand that if there are people who grew up in Ireland who live in Germany, such as myself, they may want to go back and read the stories again, or they may want to discover it in a new language, but I don't necessarily know if it was the best idea. I will unfortunately say that Oh My God, What a Complete Aisling is probably my least favourite of the series. I've read them all a couple of times, and I always struggle a little bit with the first one. There are a couple of things that Aisling does that I don't necessarily agree with. There's a lot of miscommunication in this book. There are a lot of kind of immature decisions that are made or childish things that are done, and I just wish that there was a time that both of them would sit down and talk to one another. Aisling and John would have some kind of a conversation, and I feel like it would take away a lot of what happened in the book. It would just solve so many of the problems that had happened. Then I picked up Battle Royal by Lucy Parker, and I think this one just did not hit the mark for me. I did finish it, but I think it was just a little bit different than how I had hoped it would be. I am a huge Bake Off fan. I absolutely live for that little 12-week stint in autumn where I can curl up on the couch with some cake, with a tea, and just watch 12 people completely lose their minds about whether or not chocolate is going to temper. And this book did promise me some of that, but I don't know if it delivered on all of it. This book is about Sylvie and Dominic. Sylvie appeared on Operation Cake about 4 years ago, and Dominic was one of the judges there, and he is very much your Paul Hollywood character. He's very cold, he is very unapproachable, and Sylvie's lasting memory on the show is of exploding a unicorn's horn in his face. 4 years later, one of the princesses, Princess Rose, has just announced her engagement, and she pits Dominic and Sylvie against one another for them to get the contract to make the cake for her wedding. Now, I think this is one of the things that I would change about this if I were writing the book. I would put the two of them together to make the cake themselves, rather than have them going head to head about who's going to get the contract. I think it just would have given them a little bit more of a chance for the enemies to lovers to shine through, because they would have been spending so much time together, and because they would have had to actively work together and try to put their differences aside. I just think that missed the mark a little bit. I feel as well like overall there was too much happening in this book. There was Sylvie and Dominic having to compete with each other to get the contract for the wedding cake. There was trying to figure out what one of the flavoured profiles that they wanted to feature in the cake was. There was Johnny, who was the groom and a member of his social circle who had feelings for him. There was one of Dominic's uncles who had a lover in the past. There was all of the Operation Cake stuff, because Sylvie was brought back as one of the judges of Operation Cake 4 years after her appearance there. It was too much. There was just too much going on, and I found it really hard to focus on one thing. I was listening to the audiobook of this at work, and I found that I was tuning out and that I was skipping over things in my head far more often than I should have been. There should have been times where I knew exactly where I was going and what was happening, when I felt like I was completely lost. It was like I've been being dragged in too many directions and my head was spinning in too many ways. I think it just needed to be put together a little bit better. It just needed to be tightened up a little bit more. I don't think this is a series I'm going to continue, which is sad because, as I said, I really enjoyed the concept of it. I really enjoyed the idea of a baking romance. It's just not one that I'm going to go back to. Finally, the last book that I finished in February is When in Rome by Sarah Adams. I was really excited about this one because I know that this is not a very explicit open door romance, and I felt like I needed a kind of a palate cleanser with all of the open door romances I've been reading lately. This is a really nice way to kind of ease back into that. This is about Amelia, who is also known as Ray Rose, a worldwide superstar. She is a really successful and really famous singer, but everything is kind of starting to climb up on her at the moment. So she gets into her car and heads for Rome. She is inspired by the Roman Holiday, her favorite Audrey Hepburn movie, and heads for Rome, Kentucky, because Rome, Italy is a little bit out of the scope at the moment. While she is on her way, her car breaks down outside of Noah's house, and he takes pity on her and takes her in for a couple of days while she is organising everything and while her car is in the mechanic's shop being repaired. What follows then is basically Amelia trying to stay out of Noah's way and Noah trying to avoid Amelia at every situation possible, but they are basically drawn together like magnets, and the chemistry between the two of them is fantastic. This book shows that you do not need to have explicit sex scenes and you do not need to have open door romances for the chemistry to absolutely sizzle off the pages. I truly loved this, but I think something that I loved the most about this was actually Noah's three sisters. They were obviously such a close-knit group. They were not just sisters, they were also each other's really good friends, even best friends I would go to say. But they were so welcoming and so open to Amelia joining their little club. There's a scene where Amelia and the three sisters go out for a drink one night, and basically one of the sisters says to everyone in the bar, "We know who she is, you know who she is, but we're not going to make a big deal about it." And I feel like that is something that Amelia was just searching for the entire book. She just wanted to be a wallflower, fade into the background, and not have a big deal made about who she was. I absolutely loved this book. It is the first in a series. The other book in this series follows Annie, who is Noah's oldest sister and works in a flower shop, I think. So it's going to be a nice little tie-in for the rest of my February reading, that I also read another book with a person who owns a flower shop in it. And this is going to continue on one of the series. So I'm really excited to get that one picked up as well. That is how my February reading went for this year. What is the best book that you read in February, or did you make use of your extra day in the year and spend it all reading? If you'd love to leave me a comment but you can't think of anything you'd like to say, then to honour and leap year, I'd like you to just leave me a frog emoji. Don't forget to like and subscribe because I have new videos up every week. Now, get on out of here.